HOA Story 1, The Flamingo Rebellion. The neighborhood had always been painfully ordinary. Each lawn was trimmed with precision of a military haircut. Every mailbox stood at the same height, and the identical beige houses seemed to blend into one long, lifeless row. It was the kind of place where silence was allowed to sound. The Homeowners Association, the HOA, demanded uniformity, and the residents had grown used to living inside its suffocating cage. One summer morning, the silence broke. When residents opened their curtains, they found something strange. A single pink plastic flamingo stood planted in one front yard, its head tilted, its beady eyes watching the street. At first, neighbors laughed. It was tacky, perhaps a joke. But by the following morning, more flamingos appeared. Dozens. Some wore sunglasses, some balanced party hats. One had a little cardboard sign that read, HOA doesn't own us. The laughter turned into whispers. Whispers turned into irritation. And by the third day, the HOA board marched out like a small army. They taped violation notices to doors, citing unapproved decorations and unauthorized alterations to the community aesthetic. The flamingos, they claimed, violated everything the neighborhood stood for. But the notices didn't stop them. That night, new flamingos appeared in greater numbers. They stood on rooftops, stared from windows, and gathered in clusters across the lawns. Every time the HOA confiscated one, 3 more would pop up in its place. They seemed to multiply in the shadows, like a rebellion growing in silence. The neighborhood began to change. What had once been rows of identical houses now looked like a carnival of pink, surreal creatures watching over every street. The HOA doubled their efforts, threatening fines, mailing letters, even attempting to search garages for hidden stockpiles of flamingos. Yet the harder they fought, the stranger became. One evening, the residents awoke to find the central fountain of the neighborhood park filled with flamingos, hundreds of them, glowing under the streetlights. It was no longer a joke. It was defiance. The emotional tide shifted. Some residents secretly cheered. For years, they had lived under the HOA's iron fist, too afraid to plant a rose bush without written permission. The flamingos became a symbol of freedom, a pink army fighting against control. Others felt uneasy. They whispered about who was behind it and whether the rebellion was even human at all. Then came the shock. On the 7th night, security cameras caught something chilling. The footage showed the flamingos moving. Slowly, stiffly, like puppets, they walked across the lawns, dragging themselves into new positions. Their shadows stretched unnaturally under the moonlight. The HOA president watched the footage in disbelief, replaying it over and over. They weren't being placed. They were placing themselves. When the video leaked, panic spread. What began as amusement twisted into horror. Parents pulled their children indoors at sunset. Residents taped their windows shut. The HOA ordered mass removal, hiring trucks to sweep the neighborhood. By dawn, every flamingo was gone, scooped up and carted away. For a moment, the streets returned to silence. But silence didn't last. The following night, the neighborhood woke to a sight none of them would ever forget. The flamingos were back, thousands of them this time, covering every inch of grass, roof, and street. They stood shoulder to shoulder, an endless sea of pink. Each one had a tiny HOA violation notice taped to its chest. The HOA president resigned the next morning. He packed his car and left without saying goodbye. The board collapsed within weeks, unable to enforce rules when the very symbol of control had turned against them. The community was left leaderless, forever marked by the strange uprising. To this day, no one admits to starting it. Some claim it was an elaborate prank. Others insist it was supernatural. What mattered most wasn't the truth, but the change it sparked. The neighborhood was never the same. Residents planted gardens without approval. They painted shutters bold colors. And sometimes, late at night, a flamingo still appeared in the Yara house that tried too hard to fit in. The rebellion was more than plastic birds. It was a reminder carved into memory. Control has limits, and even in the quietest suburbs, resistance can grow, sometimes in the strangest, pinkest shapes imaginable. HOA Story 2, The President's Long Goodbye. For years, he ruled the neighborhood like a quiet dictator. His name was Mr. Greaves, the HOA president who knew every bylaw, every loophole, every fine that could be squeezed from the residents. The streets looked pristine under his reign. Lawns manicured, shutters uniform, trash bins hidden precisely 3 inches from the curb. But behind the polished veneer was resentment. People whispered about him, cursed him under their breath, but few dared to challenge him. He wasn't just enforcing rules. He was inventing them. When the notice came that Mr. Greaves would be stepping down, the neighborhood sighed with relief. His resignation letter, neatly typed and mailed to every house, explained that he had fulfilled his duty and was moving on to enjoy retirement. It seemed almost anticlimactic. The tyrant was leaving on his own terms, or so it appeared. The weeks that followed told a different story. Almost immediately, strange notices began to appear in mailboxes, new violations, arbitrary and confusing. One family was fined for hanging wind chimes. Another received a letter about a non-compliant lawn ornament, though the ornament had been approved years earlier. Residents lined up outside the HOA office, demanding explanations, but Mr. Greaves remained evasive. He waved papers in the air, claimed new amendments had been passed, and dismissed complaints with a smirk. The emotional wave shifted from relief to suspicion. Why was a man about to retire tightening his grip? Why, if he was leaving, did he seem more desperate for control than ever? Then the fines grew larger. Hundreds of dollars for non-standard paint shades or excessive grass height. Some families panicked, worried about losing their homes. Others grew angry, banding together, questioning how much authority one man could still wield. Finally, someone acted. A resident who worked in local government filed a request for HOA financial records, a right legally guaranteed. At first, the board resisted, but the pressure mounted, and eventually, a box of documents appeared on the office desk. The box was chaos. Receipts for landscaping services that had never been performed, payments to companies no one had ever heard of, checks written directly to Mr. Greaves's personal account, hidden under vague labels like administrative reimbursement. For years, he had siphoned money from the community, cloaking theft beneath the language of order and compliance. The shock spread like wildfire. Neighbors who once kept to themselves gathered in driveways, passing photocopied pages of evidence, each discovery fueling outrage. They had been robbed, not just financially, but of trust, dignity, and peace of mind. But perhaps the most unsettling detail was this. The resignation letter had been sent out before the records were requested. Mr. Greaves knew the walls were closing in. His retirement wasn't an ending, it was an escape. One by one, residents confronted him. He denied everything, of course. He smiled that same smile he had worn during years of petty fines, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. But by then, no one believed him. The emotional tide reached its peak when he finally left. His moving van arrived in the dead of night. He packed boxes quickly, avoiding eye contact, while the neighbors stood in silence on their porches. They didn't yell. They didn't curse. They simply watched, their quiet judgment heavier than any words. By sunrise, his house was empty, blinds drawn, mailbox stuffed with unanswered letters. The HOA collapsed in his absence. Without him, the rules seemed flimsy, hollow. Residents voted for new leadership, a committee instead of president, and promised transparency. They painted doors brighter colors, planted gardens, and hung wind chimes without fear. Yet the scars remained. For months afterward, people still glanced at their mailboxes with dread, half expecting another violation notice sign with his name. Some swore they saw him in town, watching from his car, though no one ever proved it. Others believed he had vanished completely, fleeing before legal consequences could catch him. The long goodbye, as neighbors called it, became a story whispered to newcomers. It was more than gossip. It was a warning. Power unchecked corrodes not just institutions, but communities. And sometimes the true shock isn't the crimes committed, but in how long they remain hidden. Years later, the house where Mr. Greaves once lived still stands. Its shutters are painted a shade of blue he never would have allowed. A family lives there now, children laughing in the yard, their toys scattered across the lawn in glorious violation of every rule he enforced. The laughter is louder than the silence he once demanded, proof that his reign ended not with control, but with freedom. And yet, late at night, when the street is quiet again, some swear they can almost hear the shuffle of papers, the scratch of a pen signing another violation notice that will never arrive. Story 3. The farm that HOA tried to claim. The land had been in the Dawson family for nearly a century. Rolling fields, a weather-red barn, and an old oak tree that stood like a guardian at the edge of the property. To them, the farm was more than dirt and wood. It was memory, tradition, and survival. The HOA had no place there, or so they thought. It started with a letter, a crisp envelope stamped with the emblem of a newly formed homeowners association. The words were polite at first, almost charming. Welcome to the community. As we expand, we look forward to ensuring a unified aesthetic. Dawson nearly laughed when he read it. A farm wasn't a suburban cul-de-sac. He tossed the letter aside, assuming it was a mistake. But the letters kept coming. One warned about unauthorized fencing. Another cited non-standard landscaping. Each accusation made less sense than the last. The Dawsons didn't mow lawn for show. They tended crops. They didn't choose flower beds. They rotated soil for harvest. But the HOA didn't care about history or practicality. It cared about control. The emotional waves rolled slowly at first. Confusion, irritation, then disbelief. The farm had stood long before the HOA existed. Yet somehow the board insisted the land fell under its jurisdiction. Fines arrived next, absurd in scale. Hundreds of dollars for leaving equipment outside, thousands for not conforming to community design. When the Dawsons refused to pay, the HOA escalated. Representatives marched onto the property with clipboards, pointing at the barn and muttering about violations. They claimed a section of the farm's pasture was common ground. It wasn't. It was family land backed by generations of deeds and tax records. Still, the HOA spoke with the arrogance of power. Certain intimidation would be enough. But intimidation failed. Dawson pulled record from county archives, maps marked in fading ink, tax receipts signed decades before the HOA ever existed. He carried them to board meetings, slamming the evidence on the tables, demanding explanations. The board shifted uncomfortably, hiding behind vague bylaws and rehearsed phrases. Their composure cracked when neighbors began to notice. If the HOA could claim the Dawson farm, what was safe? The tension grew into open conflict. HOA trucks parked outside the farm, taking photos. Notices were stapled to fence posts. At night, Dawson heard voices on the road, muttering about easements and zoning. The farm felt less like a home and more like a battlefield. Then came the shock. One morning, Dawson received a document slipped under his door. Not a fine, not a notice, but a deed transfer. According to the papers, a portion of his land had been reclassified and transferred to a developer closely tied to the HOA. It was theft disguised as paperwork, an attempt to erase a century of ownership with a signature no one in his family had written. Rage turned into resolve. Dawson gathered allies, neighbors who had once shrugged at HOA rules but now feared their reach. Together, they launched a challenge in court. Lawyers poured over the fraudulent documents, exposing inconsistencies and signatures that didn't match. The HOA fought back, pouring money into its defense, but the truth was heavier than their schemes. The courtroom battle stretched for months. Each session was another wave of emotion, hope, despair, exhaustion. The HOA's lawyers argued technicalities, while Dawson held up faded photographs of his grandparents standing in front of the same barn, they now threatened to erase. When the judge finally spoke, the decision was clear. The land belonged to the Dawson family. The HOA's claims were not only invalid but fraudulent. The ruling was a victory, but not without scars. The Dawsons had lost money, time, and peace. Their trust in the community was shattered. Neighbors who had once blindly paid fines now looked at the HOA with suspicion, realizing how close they had all come to losing more than money. In the aftermath, the HOA board fractured. Some members resigned, ashamed or afraid. Others clung to their positions, vowing to rebuild trust. But the authority they once held had evaporated. The Dawsons returned to their farm, weary yet unbroken, the oak tree still standing tall, as if guarding them against further trespass. Years later, people still speak of the battle. New residents hear it as a cautionary tale whispered over fences and backyard barbecues. Story 4, Nuclear Revenge Against the HOA. The Maplewood subdivision was supposed to be paradise. At least, that's how the brochures described it. Peaceful streets, perfect lawns, and a community governed with fairness. At first, new residents believed it. The houses were fresh, the neighbors seemed friendly, and the HOA promised to protect property values. But soon, the mask slipped. The board, led by its iron-fisted president, Mrs. Halpern, treated rules not as guidelines, but as weapons. Fines rained down for trivialities. A garbage can visible 5 minutes too long. A shade of beige paint deemed non-compliant. A bicycle left leaning against a garage door. For some, the harassment was manageable, just another bill to pay. But for Tom Adler, it became war. Tom was a quiet man, a retired engineer who had moved into Maplewood to enjoy his golden years. He kept his home tidy, his lawn green, his presence unobtrusive. Yet from the moment he arrived, the HOA targeted him. They fined him for planting roses without pre-approval. They accused him of storing tools improperly when he fixed his fence. Then came the most absurd violation of all, a $500 fine for hanging a small American flag on his porch. At first, Tom complied. He paid what he could, tried to avoid trouble, but the attacks grew relentless. He soon realized the fines weren't about rules. They were about power. The board singled him out because he didn't attend meetings, didn't flatter the president, didn't play the political games. He was easy prey. The emotional waves turned dark. Tom grew anxious, then furious, then desperate. The breaking point came when he opened a letter threatening foreclosure on his home. The HOA claimed unpaid fines had ballooned into thousands of dollars, enough to justify seizing his property. A home he had bought outright, with no mortgage, now dangled under their greedy hands. That night, Tom sat at his desk, staring at the notice. Rage pulsed through him, but beneath it was clarity. He was an engineer. He knew how systems worked. And the HOA was just another system, one he could dismantle piece by piece. Revenge wouldn't be petty. It would be nuclear. The plan began quietly. Tom filed formal requests for financial transparency, citing state law that required HOAs to provide records to members. The board stalled, ignored, and denied. But every refusal was documented. Every letter, every email, every voicemail went into a thick folder Tom kept under lock and key. Then he dug deeper. Public records revealed that Mrs. Halpern and 2 board members had ties to a landscaping company that won every community contract. The company charged triple the market rate for mowing and trimming. Another trail led to a security firm billing thousands of patrols that never happened. It was theft hiding in plain sight, disguised as HOA business. The tension mounted. Tom leaked hints to neighbors, carefully at first, just enough to spark doubt. People who once shrugged at fines began asking questions. Meetings turned heated. The board dismissed accusations, but the whispers grew louder. Finally, Tom struck. He delivered a package of documents to the county attorney's office, complete with financial records, conflict of interest disclosures, and evidence of embezzlement. He also gave copies to local journalists, ensuring silence was no longer possible. Within weeks, investigators swarmed the HOA office. The story exploded across town. The emotional wave crested. Residents who had felt powerless for years now stood in open rebellion. They confronted board members on their doorsteps. They demanded resignations, shouted in meetings, and cheered when subpoenas arrived. The shock came when arrests followed. Mrs. Halpern, the president who had terrorized the community, was led away in handcuffs. 2 board members joined her, charged with fraud, embezzlement, and misuse of funds. The landscaping company collapsed under investigation. What began as petty fines ended with prison sentences. The fallout was massive. The HOA dissolved under court order, its accounts frozen, its contracts void. For the first time in decades, residents controlled their neighborhood directly. They painted homes the colors they wanted, planted gardens without permission, and tore down the signs that once warned of strict compliance. And Tom? He never boasted. He never shouted, "I told you so." He simply sat on his porch, a quiet smile beneath the flag he had rehung the day the HOA collapsed. Neighbors passed by, nodding with respect, some whispering, "Thank you," under their breath. He had given them back their freedom, not through anger alone, but through precision. But the story didn't fade. Newcomers still hear it, pass along in hushed tones. The man who took down the HOA. It isn't told as gossip, but as legend, a warning to future tyrants. Power might grow unchecked for a time, but eventually, someone patient, someone determined, will turn the system against itself. That legend became Maplewood's truest rule. Never underestimate the quiet man with a folder full of evidence.